So we're continuing with chapter 6 today, which again is over percents. You should have your notes by now, so make sure you are on page 193 in your textbook. While you're listening to the first part, we're just going to review the big idea for the chapter, the objective for the lesson, and then some of the biblical worldview for this chapter, as well as just the overarching biblical integration for math in general. So make sure you're turning to that so we're ready to go when we're practicing the problems. So again, for math for chapter 6, percents, you can use percents to compare quantities expressed per 100. For lesson 3, our objective is that we will be able to find the percent of a number accurately on 3 out of 4 problems. So that's 3/4 of the problems you should get correct. Make sure you're asking for help when we do independent practice, if you need it. And that would equate to a certain percentage that maybe you're thinking of. And then you should have already written your test date down yesterday, as well as today written down your planner. Remember that we have reviewed this already, as well as learned that generally overarching in math, that math is the language of science, and science involves studying God's created world. And why math concepts work is because math remains constant due to the fact that God is faithful to uphold all things. Percents show up everywhere. We talked about several different ways percents can be in the world yesterday. These were just some of them, and we gave examples of those. So a lot of them will happen in your real life situations when you're an adult, and you can definitely find them when you shop with your parents now. And then we just talked about percents being a different way to notate a problem, and you can also compare them to decimals and fractions and even ratios like we did yesterday. Percents are just a portion out of 100. We talked about the etymology of percent, that it comes from the Latin word percentum, which means by the hundred, and that we're going to use our God-given ability to observe aspects of numbers to find the percent of a number and compare that to decimal and fraction form. So we know that God is faithful with our work as percents, just as he is with our other mathematical concepts. And we have these different notations because God created an amazing world that's very organized and very ordered. And the different notations just help us describe different situations that we'll encounter in the world. So we might use percents for one situation, whereas a ratio might make more sense for a different situation. We talked about percents can be converted into these different things, and they could be thought of as a part or a whole. We're going to practice some of those today, depending on which type of problem it is. And then we practiced some conversions yesterday. So we found what 10% maybe was, and then we converted that to a decimal and then a fraction, just like you can see up here. And then we also did a ratio. So this would be 1 to 10 as a ratio. Today we're going to move into what is 10% of $100, or what's 1/10 of $100, which you already know how to calculate, or what's 1/10 of $100, which again, you already know how to calculate. So this example will show up here for you. You know how to do this, 10 over 100 times $100. So you'd put the 100 over 1, and then you could just calculate that, and you should get $10. You also know how to do the decimal. So you make 1/10 as a decimal, and then multiply it times 100, which I'm sure your magic calculator generator would tell you and make sure that you knew what it was. Even if you had done it on paper, it would confirm your answer, and that would be $10 as well. And then the percent you could calculate. Most of you probably would change this 10% into a decimal and then multiply it to get your $10. So I can do that with money. I can also find the percent of a number of hours. Okay, so if I said what's 10% or 1/10 or 1/10 of 24 hours, so maybe I want to know how much that is so that I can donate and give that time to the church or serve in some way. I can calculate that same way. I would have 10 over 100 for my fraction, just like the problem before, times 24, and then 1/10 times 24, and then 10% times 24, which I might need to convert into a decimal or a fraction. And you'll notice here that this says 2 4/10, this says 2 4/10, but when I simplify my fraction, I get a mixed number that's 2 2/5. Tell your neighbor why you think that is. So the reason that is because 2 4/10, the fractional part of this mixed number would be able to be simplified down to 2/5. So 10% of 100 is $10, and 10% of 24 hours is 2 4/10 hours. Percents can be used to calculate the percent of a number, just like we did here. So remember, math is a language of science. Science involves studying God's creation, and math remains constant because God is faithful to uphold all things. Do you really believe that God is faithful to uphold these math concepts? So it's one thing to say that God is in charge of your life, but a very different thing to let that belief take hold of every part of your life. So that's something that we all have to make a decision in. There's only two ways to live. You either follow Jesus and you follow Christ, or you do not. So this is part of it. Do you believe that we are studying God's created world and that math concepts remain constant because he's faithful? That's something that we all have to decide along with whether he's faithful or not. So we're going to start in our notes. You should already be on page 193. Okay, we're going to obviously, like we said, find the percent of a number. Very rarely do I ever do the learn section, but we're going to do the learn section today, and we're going to go through several different methods. Okay, so we're going to go over method number 1, which is going to be your unit rate method, which we'll do here. And then we'll do method number 2, which is going to be your fractional method. And then we're going to do method number 3, which is your decimal method. Okay, so let's start with the unit rate. Okay, so right here you can see that this is 5%, and that this whole rectangle is 100%, which is known as the base. Okay, just like if you had a fraction, the base would be your whole. So we know that 100% would be the whole. Okay, and then it said, the problem says, find 5% of 160. Remind your neighbor what of means, what operation we should use. Hopefully your neighbor said multiplication. Okay, so we need to find 5% of 160. Okay, so if we come down here, we know that 100% is equal to 100 parts. Okay, and that 100 parts would be the number 160. Okay, then I come down and I find 100 divided by what equals 1, because now I'm going to find what 1% is. If you don't know, you can use your calculator, I guess, but hopefully you know that math fact. 100 divided by what is 1? You could do 100 divided by 1 and get the answer. This is where sometimes it's funny because you know you've known this math fact for a long time, but you'll think you need your calculator to figure it out. And then using proportions, I do the same thing over here. 160 divided by 100. I would just move my decimal place 2 to the left. So 1 part would be 1 and 60 hundredths, or I could say 1 and 6 tenths. That would be fine. Okay, so that is my unit rate. It's per 1 part. And then I need to get to what 5 parts would be, because that would be equal to the 5%. So from 1% to 5%, 1 times what equals 5? It would be 5. So then I'm going to take the 1 and 60 hundredths times 5. Okay, you can do that down here if you'd like. Or, of course, you know I allow you to use your calculator. But oftentimes you'll find you can do it just as quickly by hand. And then I need to place my decimal point. Remember our decimal chapter, it's 2n. So there's none in this one. So 2 plus 1 is 2 decimal places. So 1, 2. So my answer is 8. So my 5 parts here would be 8. Okay, let's try method 2, which is the fraction method. So this is the chapter we just finished with. This is going back a little bit further into fractions. Okay, so if I have my 5% over here, 5% as a fraction would be 5 over 100. And then I'm going to multiply it still because it said of 160. And to have that whole number as a fraction, I would put it over 1 because 160 divided by 1 is still 160. And that would equal, and this is where I can reduce if the numerator is divisible by something the denominator is. Doesn't matter where it is. I could take this numerator and this denominator. So I'm going to divide both of these by 10. And that's equal to 10. And this would be 16. And then I could divide this one again because 5 and 10 are both divisible by 5. This would be 1 and this would be 2. And I could again divide these, but it's getting kind of big. So I'm just going to take 1 times 16 and get 16. And 2 times 1 and get 2. And then you could divide both of these by 2 again. Or you can just do the math fact because remember the fraction line means divided by. So 16 divided by 2 equals 8. So again, we get the same answer. Okay. A good way to check yourself when you're doing these problems is to do 2 different methods, and then you can check yourself. Okay. Then we have method number 3, which is to take that 5% and just divide it by 100 to get it to be a decimal. So we divide it by 100 by moving the decimal place 2 to the left. So 5% would be 5 hundredths times 160. And then you can use your calculator for that again, or you can take 160 times 5 hundredths. Either way, you're going to get 8. Okay. So unless it tells you a specific method that you have to use when you're doing your independent practice, you can pick and choose which one you'd like. Okay, so we're going to practice one of these problems here. So let's have the boys do this problem and the girls do this problem. So boys are doing the top part and girls are doing the bottom part. So you can pick which method you want to use. And once you're done with that, if the time's not up, go ahead and do one of the other methods and possibly all 3 if you get to it. Okay, and through the magic of our notes, we have the top part. Hopefully you figured that out. Boys, pat yourself on the back if you got that right. And then ladies, yours should have been $605, which is a tiny bit tricky because it was more than 100%. So you should have been over the original amount.